"Ma'am, we require payment up front from certain customers." The sentence landed softly, almost politely, but it sliced through the warm jazz drifting across the sterling room like broken glass. Alicia Bennett stood near the hostess stand, one hand still wrapped around the strap of her purse, her chest tightening as nearby conversations faded into uncomfortable silence. The restaurant glowed with golden chandelier light reflected against polished wine glasses and dark mahogany walls, the kind of place where politicians shook hands over 12-ounce steaks and anniversary dinners cost more than a month's rent for most people. Alicia had not been back here in 12 years. Not since the night David proposed to her at table 17 beside the window overlooking downtown Chicago. Back then, they were young, broke, and laughing over one shared dessert because they could not afford two. Tonight she wore the same silver wedding ring, the same calm smile, and a navy blue dress she had pressed carefully in her apartment that afternoon. She had reserved this dinner 3 weeks ago under Bennett, but the blonde hostess behind the marble counter barely glanced at the reservation screen before her expression changed. "I'm sorry," she said stiffly. "There seems to be some confusion." Then came the whisper to another employee. Then the looks. Then the manager appeared. Claire Whitman walked toward her in sharp black heels that clicked across the floor with military precision. Tall, perfectly styled, and cold around the eyes, she carried herself like the entire restaurant belonged to her personally. She gave Alicia a thin smile that never reached her face. "Can I help you?" Alicia nodded politely. "Yes, I have a reservation for Bennett. 7:30. Claire scanned her quickly from head to toe, pausing just a second too long at Alicia's simple handbag and modest coat. "Of course," she replied, though her tone carried no warmth at all. "Before we seat you, we'll need a card on file. We've had issues with walkouts recently." Alicia blinked slowly. Around her, crystal glasses clinked softly while a waiter passed carrying plates of lobster and filet mignon. Nobody else at the entrance had been asked for payment up front. A white couple beside her exchanged awkward glances before quickly looking away. Alicia kept her composure. "I've dined here before," she said quietly. "I never needed to do that." Claire folded her arms. "Policies change." For a moment, Alicia considered leaving. The humiliation crawled beneath her skin like heat rising under sunlight, familiar in a way she hated. But then her fingers brushed against her wedding ring, and memories returned all at once. David nervously dropping the ring box 12 years earlier. The way he laughed when it slid beneath the table. The rain outside that night. The promise they made to always come back here on their anniversary, no matter how successful or busy life became. Alicia inhaled slowly and handed over her card without another word. Claire smirked faintly, almost disappointed that Alicia had not reacted. "Wonderful," she said. "Right this way." Instead of leading her toward the elegant dining room beside the windows, Claire guided her past the candlelit tables toward the back corner near the swinging kitchen doors where waiters rushed in and out carrying trays. The noise was louder there, less graceful, less visible. Alicia looked at the empty table beside a stack of folded booster seats and felt her stomach sink. "I requested the windows section," she said softly. Claire adjusted the menu with fake politeness. "Those tables are reserved for preferred guests." The words hung in the air for one brutal second too long. Alicia slowly lifted her eyes. Around her, forks paused halfway to mouths. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, dishes crashed against stainless steel while the scent of garlic butter and grilled steak filled the air. And still, Alicia Bennett remained standing, calm and dignified, even as humiliation settled over the table like a shadow. Alicia lowered herself slowly into the chair near the kitchen doors, careful not to wrinkle the navy dress she had spent nearly an hour ironing that afternoon. The table wobbled slightly against the uneven tile floor every time someone brushed past it. Waiters rushed in and out through the swinging double doors carrying trays heavy, with steaming plates, their voices sharp and hurried behind forced smiles. Every few seconds, hot air from the kitchen rolled over her table smelling of garlic, butter, grilled salmon, and expensive wine. It was nothing like the quiet, candlelit corner she remembered from years ago. Back then, David had held her hand across the table while snow fell outside the windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. He had been nervous that night, so nervous that he spilled water on himself before proposing. Alicia could still remember laughing so hard she cried while the pianist in the corner pretended not to notice. The memory warmed her chest for only a second before reality returned. Across the dining room, couples leaned close beneath soft golden lights while jazz drifted lazily through hidden speakers. A waiter refilled crystal glasses at a nearby table and never once looked in Alicia's direction. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Nobody brought water. Nobody offered bread. Her menu remained closed where Claire had dropped it without a word. Alicia folded her hands quietly in her lap, refusing to let the humiliation show on her face. At the hostess stand, she noticed Claire glance toward her table twice before whispering something to another employee. Both women looked away quickly when Alicia lifted her eyes. A young busboy finally approached carrying a metal pitcher of ice water. He looked barely 19, nervous beneath freckles and neatly combed brown hair. As he reached across the table, another server brushed hard against his shoulder by accident. The pitcher tilted suddenly, sending freezing water across Alicia's lap and dress. The young man gasped immediately. "Oh my God, ma'am, I am so sorry." Alicia inhaled sharply as cold water soaked through the fabric against her knees. Several nearby guests turned to stare. One woman winced sympathetically before lowering her eyes back to her wine glass. The busboy grabbed napkins quickly, panic spreading across his face. "I did not mean to do that. I am really sorry." Alicia forced a small smile despite the cold spreading through the fabric. "It is okay," she said softly. "Accidents happen." Before the young man could continue apologizing, Claire appeared beside the table like she had been waiting for the moment. Her expression tightened instantly. "What is going on here?" The busboy stammered nervously. "I bumped the pitcher by mistake." Claire sighed dramatically, glancing toward Alicia's soaked dress. "Unbelievable." Then her eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, perhaps this table is not working for you after all." Alicia looked up slowly. "I only asked for the table I reserved." Claire ignored the comment completely. "We are extremely busy tonight. If you are uncomfortable, there is a cafe down the street that might better suit your expectations." The sentence hit harder than the water ever could. The words were polished, professional, almost elegant, but everyone within earshot understood exactly what she meant. Alicia felt dozens of invisible eyes settle over her again. Heat crawled slowly into her cheeks while cold water still clung to her knees beneath the tablecloth. The young busboy looked horrified. "It was my fault," he said quietly. Claire silenced him with one sharp glance. Then she turned back toward Alicia with a smile so thin it barely existed. Some environments simply are not the right fit for everyone. For the first time that evening, Alicia's composure cracked just slightly. Not anger, not shame, something sadder than both. She looked around the restaurant one more time at the glowing chandeliers, the polished silverware, the couples laughing softly beneath warm amber light. 12 years ago, she and David had dreamed together in this room when they had almost nothing. Now she sat alone beside the kitchen doors feeling smaller than she had in years. And still, she refused to stand up and leave. Alicia reached for the cloth napkin beside her plate and gently pressed it against the water soaking through her dress. The fabric clung cold against her knees now, but she kept her movements calm, measured, careful not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. Around her, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Forks scraped softly against porcelain plates. A couple near the windows resumed talking in hushed voices. Somewhere near the bar, someone laughed too loudly at a joke that was probably not funny. Yet Alicia could still feel the tension lingering in the air around her table like smoke after a candle had been blown out. The young busboy remained frozen beside her, holding the empty pitcher with both trembling hands. "I really am sorry," he whispered again. Alicia looked up at him with tired kindness. "You do not need to apologize more than once." The boy swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. Before he could speak again, Claire stepped closer and adjusted the silverware on Alicia's table with stiff perfection. "Tyler," she said sharply without looking at him. "Table 12 needs clearing." The boy hesitated for half a second before nodding quickly and hurrying away. Alicia watched him disappear through the crowded dining room. He reminded her of her younger brother years ago, always nervous at his first jobs, always trying too hard not to disappoint people who had already decided what they thought of him. Claire straightened the edge of the tablecloth slowly. "You seem upset," she said in a voice polished enough to sound concerned to anyone listening from a distance. Alicia met her eyes calmly. I think you know exactly why. Claire smiled faintly. I assure you, nobody here intends to make you uncomfortable. Another lie wrapped neatly in professional language. Alicia glanced toward the glowing window section again where candles flickered against the glass overlooking the city skyline. A silver-haired man in a tailored suit had just been seated at the exact table she originally reserved. Claire followed Alicia's gaze and spoke before she even had to ask. That guest is a long-standing member. Alicia almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 12 years earlier, she and David had celebrated his first promotion in this restaurant with barely enough money to cover dessert afterward. Back then, nobody treated them like outsiders. But success changed people. Wealth changed rooms. And sometimes all it took was showing up alone for the world to decide you no longer belonged somewhere. Alicia slowly removed her soaked coat and folded it carefully beside her purse. Her wedding ring caught the chandelier light. For just a moment, flashing silver against the dark tablecloth. Claire noticed it too. Are you waiting for someone? She asked casually. My husband. Claire nodded once, though skepticism flickered immediately across her face. Of course. The response carried just enough disbelief to sting. Alicia inhaled quietly through her nose, forcing herself to remain composed. She had spent years learning how to survive moments exactly like this without giving people the reaction they wanted. Anger would only confirm whatever ugly assumptions Claire already believed. Silence, however, unsettled people more. A waiter finally appeared carrying bread and olive oil nearly 30 minutes after Alicia had been seated. He placed the basket down quickly without making eye contact. Before Alicia could even touch it, Claire leaned toward him and murmured something too low to hear. The waiter's expression shifted instantly. Embarrassment crossed his face as he reached down and removed the breadbasket again. Alicia looked up slowly. Excuse me. The waiter cleared his throat awkwardly. Complimentary bread is reserved for premium dining guests. For one long second, Alicia simply stared at the empty spot where the basket had been. Around her, nearby conversations quieted once more. Even the pianist near the bar seemed to slow his playing. Claire offered another polite smile, but this one held victory beneath it now. Small humiliations. Tiny cuts. One after another. Designed not to explode loudly, but to wear someone down until they left willingly. Alicia lowered her eyes briefly toward her wedding ring again and rubbed her thumb gently across its smooth silver edge. Then, somewhere near the front entrance of the restaurant, the heavy glass doors opened, letting cold Chicago air sweep softly through the dining room. The cold air disappeared almost as quickly as it entered, but something in the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted immediately afterward. Conversations softened. Several waiters near the entrance straightened their posture without even realizing it. Alicia looked up from the table slowly as a tall man stepped inside, wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted lightly with snowflakes from the Chicago night. David Bennett removed a pair of dark leather gloves while scanning the restaurant with calm, focused eyes. There was nothing flashy about him at first glance. No loud jewelry, no dramatic entrance. But the quiet confidence surrounding him moved through the room like an invisible current. The hostess near the front instantly recognized him. Alicia watched her face pale slightly before she hurried toward Claire and whispered something urgently into her ear. Claire frowned at first, clearly irritated by the interruption. Then she turned toward the entrance. The change in her expression was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened. Her carefully rehearsed smile vanished for half a second before snapping back into place. Mr. Bennett, she breathed, smoothing her blazer quickly as she walked forward. Alicia felt her heartbeat slow strangely instead of rise. Relief washed over her so gently it almost hurt. David had finally arrived. He glanced briefly toward Claire, but did not stop walking. His eyes continued scanning the restaurant until they found Alicia sitting alone near the kitchen doors with her soaked dress still clinging slightly to her knees beneath the table. He stopped completely. For one long second, the entire room seemed to disappear around him. Alicia saw confusion flicker across his face first, then concern, then something colder. Claire moved quickly to intercept him with polished enthusiasm. We are honored to have you here tonight, sir. Your usual table is prepared. David did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Alicia. Why is my wife sitting back there? The question was not loud, but the silence that followed it spread instantly across nearby tables. Claire blinked once. Your wife. David slowly turned his head toward her now. Alicia Bennett. He said her name carefully, deliberately, like every syllable mattered. The woman you seated beside the kitchen. Claire's face drained of color so fast, it almost looked painful. Behind her, the hostess lowered her eyes immediately. One of the waiters near the bar froze mid-step, holding a bottle of wine. Alicia remained seated quietly, one hand still resting near her wedding ring. David crossed the dining room toward her without another word. The soft glow from the chandeliers reflected against the polished floor as dozens of eyes followed him. When he reached the table, his expression softened instantly. Alicia. His voice carried warmth now, gentle and low. I am sorry I am late. Alicia managed a small smile despite everything. Traffic was terrible. David looked down briefly at the damp fabric of her dress and the untouched table in front of her. The smile faded from his face again. What happened? Before Alicia could answer, Claire stepped forward quickly. Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. David looked at her calmly, but something in his eyes made Claire hesitate immediately. A misunderstanding? Claire swallowed hard. We did not realize she was with you. The sentence escaped before she could stop herself. Too honest. Too revealing. Around the room, several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. David remained perfectly still for a moment. Then he glanced slowly around the restaurant, taking in the isolated table near the kitchen doors, the missing bread service, the damp napkins beside Alicia's plate. Tiny details. Quiet humiliations. Every one of them suddenly obvious. Alicia touched his hand gently before anger could settle fully into his expression. David. He looked back down at her immediately. I am fine. But David knew her too well. He noticed the way she kept smoothing the edge of her wet dress beneath the table. The way her shoulders remained just slightly tense. The way her smile looked smaller tonight than it had that morning when she kissed him goodbye before work. Claire tried again, voice thinner now. Mr. Bennett, if you allow me, we can move Mrs. Bennett to a more appropriate table immediately. David slowly straightened to his full height and turned toward her once more. The restaurant had gone completely silent now except for the faint piano music drifting from the bar. No, he said quietly. I think everybody should stay exactly where they are. Claire's polished composure began cracking around the edges the moment David Bennett pulled out the chair beside Alicia and sat down at the small table near the kitchen doors instead of moving to the luxurious private section prepared for him. A ripple of confusion spread quietly through the dining room. Waiters exchanged uncertain glances. The pianist near the bar slowed his playing almost unconsciously. Nobody seemed to understand why one of the most respected business figures in Chicago had chosen to sit beside the service hallway with his wife instead of demanding special treatment. David removed his overcoat carefully and draped it over the back of his chair before looking again at the damp stain across Alicia's dress. You are freezing, he said softly. Alicia shook her head once. I am all right. But her voice carried exhaustion now. The kind that settled deep beneath the skin after too many small humiliations stacked together. David noticed everything immediately. The missing bread plates. The untouched water glass. The nervous way nearby staff kept pretending not to stare. Claire stepped closer to the table again, forcing a smile so tight it looked painful. Mr. Bennett, we truly apologize for any inconvenience this evening. If you would allow us to relocate you both to our executive dining suite, I can personally arrange complimentary. David raised one hand slightly. Claire stopped talking at once. The silence around the table became almost unbearable. How long has my wife been sitting here? He asked calmly. Claire hesitated. Approximately 30 minutes. David glanced toward Alicia. Without service? Alicia tried to interrupt gently. David, please. But he was already looking back at Claire again. Did someone spill water on her? Claire swallowed. There was a minor accident. And the bread. Claire blinked once, clearly not expecting the question. Excuse me. David's tone never rose. Somehow that made it worse. My wife was offered bread. Then it was removed from her table. What? Several employees standing nearby lowered their eyes immediately. Claire's face flushed faintly beneath the chandelier light. There appears to have been confusion regarding dining privileges. David leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her with a calmness that felt far more dangerous than anger. Dining privileges. He repeated the phrase quietly, almost like he wanted to hear how ugly it sounded out loud. Alicia placed her hand gently over his. I do not want a scene. David turned toward her immediately, his expression softening again. You are not causing one. For a brief second, Alicia saw something deeper beneath his controlled exterior. Hurt. Not for himself. For her. Because David Bennett remembered exactly what it felt like to be dismissed by rooms like this. 12 years earlier, he had walked into this same restaurant wearing a discount suit from a clearance rack, while managers looked at him like he did not belong there either. The only difference now was money. And tonight, seeing Alicia treated this way reminded him how fragile respect became when people thought nobody important was watching. Claire straightened her shoulders carefully. Mr. Bennett, I assure you, no offense was intended. David looked at her quietly for several seconds. That is interesting. Claire forced another uneasy smile. How so? David folded his hands together on the table. Because offense was clearly delivered. The words settled over the restaurant with crushing weight. Somewhere near the back, a server accidentally dropped a fork onto the floor, the metallic clatter echoing sharply through the silence. Alicia noticed Tyler, the young busboy, standing frozen near the kitchen entrance watching everything unfold with wide, anxious eyes. Claire noticed him too. Everyone returned to work. She snapped suddenly, her voice tighter than before. Nobody moved immediately. Then David spoke again, still calm. No, let them stay. Claire turned back toward him, completely unsettled now. Sir. David's gaze drifted slowly around the dining room, taking in every nervous face, every uncomfortable glance, every guest pretending not to listen. I think people should hear this part too. Alicia exhaled quietly beside him, her fingers tightening gently around the edge of the tablecloth. She knew that tone in her husband's voice. Calm on the surface, absolute beneath it. And for the first time that evening, Claire Whitman looked genuinely afraid. Claire Whitman stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, her carefully polished authority unraveling more with every passing second. Around the restaurant, guests pretended to focus on their meals, but nobody truly was anymore. The entire dining room had become quiet in the strange way public spaces do when people sense something important is unfolding. Even the soft jazz from the speakers now sounded distant, almost fragile beneath the tension pressing against the walls. David Bennett rested one arm along the back of Alicia's chair while keeping his eyes fixed calmly on Claire. He still had not raised his voice once. Somehow that unsettled her more than anger ever could. Mr. Bennett, she said carefully, if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, we would be more than willing to make this right. David tilted his head slightly. Make what right exactly? Claire opened her mouth, but no answer came immediately, because now she understood the trap inside the question. To answer honestly would mean admitting what everyone in the room already suspected. Alicia sat quietly beside him, fingers folded neatly in her lap again. The cold water stain across her navy dress had begun drying unevenly beneath the warm restaurant lights, leaving darker patches across the fabric. David noticed it every time he looked down at her. And every time he noticed it, something hardened behind his eyes. Tyler still lingered near the kitchen entrance pretending to organize silverware while secretly listening. Alicia caught his nervous expression and offered him a small, reassuring smile. The gesture seemed to surprise him. Most people humiliated publicly did not still think about comforting others. Claire finally found her voice again. We simply followed standard procedure. David looked around slowly at the surrounding tables filled with wealthy guests sipping wine beneath candlelight. Interesting, he said softly, because I did not see anyone else asked to pay up front tonight. Claire's lips parted slightly. Sir, I can explain. Please do. The words landed gently, but Claire visibly struggled beneath them. Alicia reached for David's hand beneath the table and squeezed it once. Not to stop him, to ground him. She knew how quickly disappointment could turn into bitterness if people held on to it too long. David glanced down at her hand briefly, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased. Alicia, he said quietly, still looking at her, why did you stay? She looked at him for a moment before answering. Because 12 years ago this place meant something beautiful to us. Her voice remained soft, but now the entire restaurant could hear every word. I did not want somebody else's cruelty to take that memory away. The silence afterward felt enormous. Claire lowered her eyes briefly for the first time all evening. Not out of remorse yet. Out of discomfort. Because Alicia had responded with dignity instead of outrage, and dignity was much harder to defend yourself against. David studied his wife carefully. He remembered that first anniversary dinner after he and Alicia got married, when they split one slice of cheesecake because money was tight and laughed all the way home walking through freezing snow with broken umbrella spokes twisting in the wind. Alicia had never cared about status, never cared about expensive rooms or luxury treatment. She only cared about people, which made tonight somehow even uglier. One of the older guests near the window finally cleared his throat quietly. "Young lady," he said toward Claire, "the woman deserves an apology." Several heads nodded subtly around the room. Claire's composure tightened again. Public opinion had shifted now, and she knew it. David looked back toward her calmly. "You know what the worst part is?" Claire swallowed hard, but remained silent. "You saw my wife sitting here alone," David continued quietly, "and you decided she could be treated differently because you thought nobody important would walk through that door for her." Claire's face lost what little color remained in it. Alicia lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver ring on her finger. The restaurant lights reflected softly against its smooth surface. She remembered the exact moment David placed it on her hand years ago. He had promised her then that no matter how successful life became, he would never let the world make her feel invisible. Tonight, sitting beside her near the kitchen doors while an entire restaurant watched in silence, he was keeping that promise. Claire Whitman looked like someone trying to stand upright, while the floor disappeared beneath her feet inch by inch. The confidence she had worn so effortlessly earlier that evening was gone now, replaced by the strained expression of a person realizing too late that every quiet decision they made had been witnessed by the wrong eyes. But David Bennett was no longer interested in humiliating her. That became clear in the way he turned back toward Alicia instead of continuing the confrontation. He reached for the cloth napkin beside her untouched plate and gently dabbed another small drop of water from the edge of the table. Such a simple movement, but it changed the entire atmosphere around them. Because suddenly this was no longer about power or status. It was about care, about dignity, about a husband seeing the woman he loved hurt in a room full of strangers and choosing not to let her sit alone in it anymore. Alicia watched him quietly, emotion flickering behind her composed expression for the first time all night. "You should not have come straight from the airport," she murmured softly. David gave a faint smile. "Missing our anniversary dinner would have been a dangerous decision." A few uneasy laughs escaped from nearby tables, breaking some of the tension hanging over the room. Even Alicia smiled a little at that. Claire remained standing nearby, unsure whether to stay or disappear completely. The older gentleman near the window who had spoken earlier finally leaned back in his chair and looked toward her again. "Young lady," he said calmly, "there is still time to handle this with grace." Claire swallowed hard. Grace. The word seemed to land heavier than any threat could have. She glanced slowly around the dining room and saw it clearly now. The guests watching her, the staff avoiding her eyes. Tyler standing silently near the kitchen doors, still clutching a stack of folded napkins against his chest. Nobody looked impressed anymore, only uncomfortable. Because once cruelty became visible, it stopped looking sophisticated. It just looked small. Claire finally turned toward Alicia fully. "Mrs. Bennett," she began quietly, "I owe you an apology." Alicia looked up at her without hostility. That somehow made it harder. "You were treated unfairly tonight," Claire continued carefully, each word sounding difficult to force out. "And I made assumptions that never should have been made." The room remained silent around them except for the soft clinking of ice against glasses somewhere near the bar. Alicia studied Claire for a moment before speaking. "You did not treat me badly because you knew who I was." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. Alicia's voice stayed gentle, but every word carried truth inside it now. "You treated me badly because you thought I was nobody important." Claire had no response. David watched his wife quietly beside him, pride flickering behind his calm expression. Alicia had always possessed that rare kind of strength that did not need to become loud to fill a room. She never chased revenge, never needed people destroyed to feel whole again. She simply forced them to face themselves honestly, and that was far more uncomfortable. Tyler suddenly stepped forward awkwardly from near the kitchen entrance, carrying a fresh basket of warm bread with both hands. "Ma'am," he said nervously toward Alicia, "I wanted to bring this back." Alicia looked at him and smiled softly. "Thank you, Tyler." The young man exhaled visibly with relief as he set the basket carefully onto the table. David noticed Claire watching the interaction closely. That young man apologized to my wife 3 times tonight, he said quietly. More accountability than I have seen from management. Claire's face tightened again with embarrassment. But before she could speak, Alicia surprised everyone. Tyler made a mistake, she said calmly. You made a choice. Another silence followed. Heavy. Honest. Claire looked suddenly exhausted beneath the restaurant lights, as if maintaining superiority all these years had become heavier than anyone realized. Outside the tall windows, snow continued drifting softly through downtown Chicago while candlelight flickered across polished glasses and silverware. And for the first time since walking into the restaurant, Alicia Bennett no longer looked small sitting beside the kitchen doors. Everyone else did. For several long seconds, nobody in the Sterling room moved at all. The restaurant seemed suspended inside a strange stillness where every person suddenly became aware of themselves, of the room, of the quiet weight hanging between dignity and shame. Claire Whitman stood beside the table with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the sharp edges of her confidence completely gone now. Across the dining room, guests who had once avoided looking at Alicia Bennett no longer seemed able to look away, because something larger than a public embarrassment had unfolded in front of them tonight. They had witnessed the exact moment a person stopped being invisible. David reached for the untouched menu beside Alicia's plate and closed it gently. We are not staying for dinner, he said calmly. Claire looked startled immediately. Sir, please, allow us the opportunity to correct this. David glanced around the restaurant slowly before answering. That opportunity existed the moment my wife walked through the door. The words landed softly but carried enough truth to make several people lower their eyes. Alicia rested her hand lightly over David's wrist. David. He looked toward her immediately, his expression softening again. Alicia took a slow breath before speaking. I do not want anyone fired tonight. Claire blinked in surprise. So did several employees nearby. Even David studied her quietly for a moment. Alicia, he said gently, you do not owe anybody mercy after this. She gave a faint sad smile. Maybe not, but I still choose it. The room fell silent again. Tyler stared openly now, clearly stunned by her response. Claire looked even more shaken than before, as if kindness somehow cut deeper than punishment could have. Alicia slowly stood from the table, smoothing the damp fabric of her navy dress one last time. Under the warm chandelier glow, the water stains still showed faintly against the material, small reminders of everything that had happened tonight. Yet somehow she no longer looked embarrassed by them. She looked human, real. David stood beside her immediately. Claire opened her mouth carefully. Mrs. Bennett, I truly am sorry. Alicia met her eyes calmly. Then change how you see people before somebody important walks through the door for them. Claire's face tightened as the meaning settled fully into her chest. Because that was the part she had failed to understand all along. Every person mattered before somebody wealthy defended them. Every person deserved dignity before status made them valuable in the eyes of a room like this. David reached for Alicia's coat and carefully helped her into it himself. The gesture was small, intimate, ordinary, yet it carried more respect than anything else displayed inside the restaurant all evening. Near the kitchen entrance, Tyler suddenly stepped forward again. Mrs. Bennett. Alicia turned toward him kindly. The young man hesitated before speaking. Thank you for being nice to me earlier. Alicia smiled softly. Do not let places like this teach you to become cold. Tyler nodded slowly, holding onto those words like they mattered. Because they did. David placed one hand gently against Alicia's back as they began walking toward the entrance together. This time, every employee stepped aside quietly to make room for them. No whispers. No suspicious glances. No forced smiles. Only silence. Respectful silence. As they passed the candlelit windows section, the older gentleman who had spoken earlier lifted his wine glass slightly toward Alicia. Ma'am, he said softly, your husband is not the impressive one tonight. Alicia smiled politely, but kept walking. Outside the towering front windows, snow drifted steadily across downtown Chicago beneath glowing streetlights. The city looked softer now somehow, quieter beneath the winter night. David opened the restaurant door for Alicia, and warm air rushed briefly against the cold outside. Before stepping through, Alicia paused for just 1 second and glanced back over her shoulder toward Claire Whitman, still standing motionless beneath the chandeliers. Their eyes met one final time. Not with hatred, not even triumph. Just truth. Then Alicia stepped out into the falling snow. Beside the man who had loved her long before anybody in that restaurant decided she was worth seeing. The snow fell quietly across downtown Chicago as David guided Alicia toward the black sedan waiting beneath the glowing streetlights. The city traffic had softened under the late hour, and the cold winter air carried that familiar stillness that only came after an emotionally exhausting night. David opened the passenger door for her carefully, but Alicia did not get in immediately. Instead, she stood beside the car for a moment with her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching snowflakes drift beneath the restaurant's golden sign behind them. The same sign that once represented one of the happiest nights of her life now looked strangely smaller from the sidewalk. David studied her face gently. "Are you all right?" Alicia released a slow breath, white against the cold air. "I think so." Her voice sounded thoughtful more than hurt now. David stepped closer beside her. "I should have been there sooner." Alicia shook her head immediately. "No, tonight was not your fault." David looked down briefly, his jaw tightening anyway. "Maybe not. But I hate that you had to sit in there alone while people decided whether you deserved kindness." Alicia reached for his hand inside the pocket of his coat, warming her fingers against his. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. David's eyes stayed on her. Alicia glanced back once toward the restaurant windows glowing warmly against the snow. It was not the table, or the comments. It was how easy it was for them. The honesty in her voice settled heavily between them. David understood immediately. Cruelty rarely announced itself loudly anymore. Sometimes it arrived smiling politely beneath expensive chandeliers while pretending to be professionalism. A gust of cold wind swept down the street, carrying loose snow across the sidewalk around their shoes. David removed his scarf and wrapped it gently around Alicia's neck despite her quiet protest. "You are freezing," he murmured. Alicia smiled faintly. "You always say that." "Because you always are." For the first time all evening, the tension between them softened, completely into something warm and familiar. The kind of love built over years of surviving difficult rooms together. Across the street, a taxi rolled slowly through the intersection while distant headlights reflected against wet pavement shimmering beneath the city lights. Alicia finally slid into the passenger seat, but before David closed the door, she touched his arm gently. "Thank you." He looked at her quietly. "For what?" Alicia's eyes glistened slightly beneath the soft dashboard light, now glowing from inside the car. "For seeing me before anyone else did." David's expression changed instantly, almost pained by the idea that she still questioned that after all these years. He leaned down slightly beside the open door. "Alicia Bennett," he said softly. "I saw you when we were splitting one slice of cheesecake because we could not afford two. I saw you when we lived in that tiny apartment with the broken heater. And I will still see you when we are old and gray arguing over crossword puzzles somewhere." Alicia laughed quietly through the emotion tightening in her chest. The sound warmed the freezing night more than the car heater ever could. David brushed one snowflake gently from her sleeve before finally closing the passenger door. As he walked around the front of the car, Alicia looked once more toward the Sterling room through the falling snow. Inside the glowing windows, she could still see figures moving beneath chandeliers and candlelight. Waiters carrying trays. Guests returning slowly to conversations. Life continuing. But somewhere in that restaurant, she knew Claire Whitman was probably standing very still tonight, replaying every decision she had made. Not because a wealthy man challenged her. Because a woman she underestimated answered humiliation with grace instead of hatred. David climbed into the driver's seat beside her and started the engine. Warm air slowly filled the car, while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together listening to the gentle rhythm of snowfall tapping against the windshield. Then David reached across the center console and took Alicia's hand again. Outside, Chicago glowed silver and gold beneath the winter sky, while the restaurant lights faded slowly behind them in the rearview mirror. And somewhere between the silence, the snow, and the warmth of his hand around hers, Alicia finally felt something return that the world had almost taken from her that night. Not pride, not victory, peace.